dropping a lot of names, so it's not so much of a history lesson. A lot of the women I picked are really important to me and to my idea of what black feminism is and black sisterhood as well. So when I was 15, I overheard a conversation between a relation and a family friend. The friend had asked the relation what was Chardine interested in, why she got green hair, and I had a lot more piercings then as well. And the person replied, "Oh, she's really into music." "Oh, what kind of music?" "Oh, you know, punk and rock, all that sort of white music, you know." And then they laughed. And this kind of stuck with me, but thinking back, I think little did they know that a lot of the bands I was listening to at the time were actually putting me on to some incredible black female musicians of the past that I'd never heard of being spoken about in interviews or documentaries in mainstream black channels like MTV Base or BET or anything like that. And I remember one day, I'm going to sound like a real bad girl now, but I was probably skipping school and watching VH1, and I was watching a documentary about Janis Joplin, who at the time I thought was the coolest, most rebellious woman I knew. And I was intrigued to learn that the person who inspired her the most, her singing style, how she approached life, was a black blues singer called Bessie Smith from the 1920s. So much so that she actually bought a headstone for Bessie Smith's unmarked grave. And a part of me went, what's this? I need to find out who this woman is. So immediately I looked Bessie Smith up, and suddenly everything for me fell into place. I started to find a trail of what I call punk black sisters, and I'll talk about what I mean when I say punk in that sense. So I use the term punk sister of sound, as to me the term punk encapsulates an anarchic DIY attitude that stands in opposition to the conventional, and the music of the women I'm going to talk about today are all in genres which created punk rock as we think about it today, and that's mostly blues and rock and roll. Blues and rock and roll, the roots of punk, just the chord progressions, the sounds, that's a black musical form. And also the reason why I chose to look at the musical roots is that those who mostly consume this music today, if you go into any record shop down the road or a record convention, or if you're watching a documentary and they're talking about blues music or early gospel music or something like that, you'll mostly see white men talking about it and writing about it. And most of the subcultures that are surrounding that music that's still happening today, like rock and roll or punk or metal or rock, it's a mostly white male space. And so that's why I've chosen to speak about these women specifically, as opposed to female hip-hop artists, which I'm still a huge fan of, so people like MC Lyte and Queen Latifah, because there's a lot written about them by black women and by black people, and I think that narrative has been told, and I think it's time for us to kind of reclaim back these women and create their stories from our perspective, because it's not really been spoken about. Okay. So if I start off talking about Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, and you can get a sense of where I'm going with this. So in the 1920s, known as the mother of blues, Ma Rainey, who actually had gold teeth and used to wear a necklace of gold dollar pieces, I mean, she had swag before the term was even invented, she used to make open references to lesbian and bisexual behaviour. And this is the 1920s, we're going back here, 1923, 25, and this woman was coming out of lyrics like this. They said I do it, ain't nobody caught me, sure got to prove it on me. Went out last night with a crowd of my friends, they must have been women because I don't like no men. So that's a song called Prove It On To Me, if anyone wants to look it up. These lyrics were actually in reference to an incident in 1925 in which Rainey was arrested for taking part in an orgy at her home involving women from her chorus. Prove It On To Me further alludes to presumed lesbian behaviour. It's true I wear a collar and a tie, talk to the girls just like any old man. And Angela Davis herself has said that the song Prove It On Me is a cultural precursor to the lesbian cultural movement of the 1970s, which began to crystallise around the performance and recording of lesbian-affirming songs. A hugely popular singer at the time, making hundreds of records that sold well, Rainey had her own travelling show that included a younger dancer who would go on to be named the Empress of Blues, and that person was Bessie Smith. At the time, Bessie Smith was the highest paid black entertainer of the day. She had her own show, she had 40 performers in the show, she had her own travelling car, railroad car, which acted as a home on tour because she didn't want her troupe to be staying in the really low quality boarding houses that were only available to blacks at the time. And she had sales figures of 100,000 copies of her records, and at her height, she was making $2,000 a week, and in today's money, actually had to calculate this. That was about £100,000 a week she was making at her height. So this is Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey were huge stars. If you looked at the top selling records of that period, it's their names. They're not some obscure artist that nobody knows about, and I'm just pulling them out from the back of a record pile. These were the equivalent of the Rihannas and the Beyoncés of their time, of how popular they were. And without Bessie Smith selling 100,000 copies, the recording industry at the time was not interested in making records for black people. They were they were marketing records for the white market. And because her record was so popular, record industries decided to start making records for the black market. So at the time, it was only blues women who were recording first. There was no male blues recorders until the later 20s and 30s. So without these women, we wouldn't have the recordings of Robert Johnson or Big Bill Broonzy or these people like I don't know, Mick Jagger or Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones reel off as their influences, the people that taught them how to play guitar. Without Bessie Smith and Rainey making those records and selling those records, what would our musical heritage be now in England? So I think that's quite an important point to keep in mind, I think, when thinking about what these women did and what they achieved and what their musical legacies are for us today. I've already touched upon that. But during the period of the time, as some of you may know, the early 20th century was an active time for black feminism and the formation of black women's clubs and the National Association of Coloured Women. However, although the biggest stars of the day were Smith and Rainey, they were often shunned by the black middle classes of the time, particularly the women. The music was seen as being representative of the generation of the African American poor. Smith's music, though, did actually speak for the black working classes, but besides the sex, drugs and whiskey, Angela Davis actually points out that Smith's songs such as Poor Man's Blues have decidedly have a black feminist consciousness that addresses social injustice and working conditions. And as for myself, as someone from a working class background, stuck in a very complicated intersection, a lot of things that she used to talk about still resonate with me today. And I think sometimes when, I don't know, you say that you're into a different kind of music that doesn't actually associate you with your class, I think. I mean, I'm from the States, so a lot of people probably would assume that I'm into grime and what have you, but that's not the case. So listening to these records from these women, you can hear a stem of black working class struggle specifically. And I think that that's something that we need to start to bring in and to understand and to relate to and write about now. And another point I want to bring on as well, which I mentioned earlier, is when we think of this period of the blues, the image that usually comes to that is of the old man sitting on a porch probably in dungarees and a necktie, singing about some railroad and some woman done him wrong and he lost his dog or something like that. But there were men around at that time. But the down at heel narrative of the bluesman came to the fore in the 40s and 50s folk and old-time revival that was led by middle-class, college-educated, left-wing white men. So even though people like Pete Seeger, for example, who passed away recently, was out there collecting records, collecting recordings. Alan Lomax, Harry Smith were out looking for something that was authentic, which they thought was the authentic blues that was lost, supposedly. But these men, like I said, were left-wing, and so the troubles of the working man, particularly the black working man narrative, suited their political agenda. They suited their political agenda as an image, but not as participants. And the black feminist songs of Smith and Rainey, too glamorous, successful, opinionated, I don't want to say anti-male, but they had a very strong sense of their own agency, and this was not considered authentic enough by these people, and also sort of putting the background. So if you think during the period of the time when someone thought of the blues, they would think these glamorous women, Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and some of the others, not the man, not the lead bellies at the time. Lead belly was in prison at the time for murder, so he wasn't making any records during that period. And there's some others as well that I just want to touch upon. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who's known as the original Soul Sister in the 30s and 40s from Arkansas. She was one of the first gospel artists to perform in both churches and secular clubs, and she was credited with bringing gospel music into the mainstream in the 1930s and 40s. And she was extremely controversial for her time, a particular performance in 1938 she did at the Carnegie Hall. It was revolutionary in several aspects. Performing gospel music in front of secular audiences and alongside blues and jazz musicians was highly unusual at the time, and within conservative religious circles the mere fact of a woman performing guitar music was frowned upon. And musically, her guitar style actually led to the formation of the guitar style for people like Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, Eric Clapton. Again, so without Eric Clapton, what would our blues and rock music be today? But this stems from Sister Rosetta Tharpe and her guitar style. So if you ever go on YouTube and watch it, check her out, and you'll see the roots of what a lot is not considered where we are, our music today. But she was a bit of a diva, and one of my favourite things about her and her sort of I don't care attitude was very much when she got married, she actually charged 25,000 people to attend her wedding, and then she performed in her wedding dress, and then there was a massive fireworks display afterwards. So, I mean, you've got to be a pretty special person to do that, really, haven't you? Still hanging around the 30s and 40s, well, actually going into the 50s now. Big Mama Thornton, another big influence on Elvis. A lot of common musical knowledge. If someone said, where did rock and roll come from, they would say Elvis, maybe the single Hound Dog. Well, Hound Dog was first recorded by Big Mama Thornton. So, without her recording that single in 1953, a couple of years later, Elvis does it already. It's forgotten that she even existed. So if someone says to you, Elvis created rock and roll, you know what to say the next time around. So there's a really great academic called Maureen Mahone who writes about black women in rock and roll, and I'd really recommend to read her stuff. And she talks about how, let me just find this quote, yes. She says something really brilliant, which I think is really interesting, how She says Presley's sexy masculinity comes into being in part as he draws on Thornton's confrontational black femininity. And I think that's such a brilliant quote, because Elvis singing that song, "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog," whatever, is bringing in his singing style from Big Mama Thornton. And so when people talk about the mainstream history of rock and roll, and they say, oh, how controversial Elvis was by being super sexy on television, and they had to ban him, and they had to only film him from the waist up because his hips were moving around everywhere. This is all coming from Big Mama Thornton. This is all coming from a confrontational black femininity. These are movements that he is using, our way of singing, our presentation, and it's being put into a white male space. And I think that's quite an interesting thing. That's probably a whole different speech. That's a really interesting point I would like people to kind of take away on that one. And so that's Big Mama Thornton, and quite a big part of punk subculture is about do-it-yourself and DIY and just picking things up. And there's a quote that Thornton said in an interview, which I think really encapsulates that. She says, "My singing comes from experience, my own experience. I never had no one to teach me nothing. I never went to school for music or nothing. I taught myself to sing and to blow harmonica and even to play drums by watching other people. I can't read music, but I know what I'm singing. I don't sing like nobody but myself." And this is, I think it's from the 50s, this quote. So, and there are other artists as well, because I think I'm probably going on a bit now, such as Polystyrene from X-Ray Specs, who for me is one of my personal heroes. As I was introduced being in a black feminist punk band, and I've spent a lot of my time growing up in punk and rock and roll subculture, and finding Polystyrene and then finding out that she was of Somali